You think medieval queens spent their days embroidering tapestries and hosting tea parties? Think again. While history books love to paint royal women as delicate flowers who swooned at the sight of blood, the reality was far more terrifying. Some of the most brutal torturers in human history wore crowns and silk gowns. These weren't your fairy tale princesses. These were women who turned human suffering into an art form. Picture this. It's 1384 in the Kingdom of Naples. Queen Joanna of France sits in her marble throne room, casually sipping wine while a man screams in the courtyard below. She's not disturbed by the sound. She ordered it. The man being flayed alive was once her lover. His crime? Trying to leave her for another woman. Joanna doesn't just punish betrayal, she orchestrates symphonies of agony that echo through castle walls for days. But here's what your history teacher never told you. Medieval queens didn't just order executions like their male counterparts. They got creative. While kings might swing a sword or order a hanging, queens developed methods of torture so elaborate, so psychologically devastating, that hardened knights would beg for a quick death instead. They understood something that modern psychology is only now catching up to. Physical pain ends. Psychological torment echoes forever. Today, I'm going to walk you through the documented cases of 5 medieval queens whose bloodlust makes modern horror movies look like children's bedtime stories. We're talking about women who kept torture chambers in their castle basements, who collected the screams of their enemies like other royals collected jewels, and who turned the act of dying into a performance art so twisted that witnesses went insane. Fair warning. What you're about to hear isn't sanitized textbook history. These are real accounts from court records, witness testimonies, and diplomatic reports that European kingdoms tried desperately to suppress. Some of this evidence only surfaced in the 1960s when historians finally gained access to sealed Vatican archives. The Catholic Church had been hiding these documents for centuries because they revealed just how far Christian queens had fallen from grace. But before we dive into the specific cases, you need to understand something crucial about medieval royal women. They lived in a world where showing weakness meant death. Not metaphorical death. Actual assassination by political rivals, family members, or ambitious nobles. Queens who couldn't inspire fear didn't survive. So when these women chose torture over mercy, it wasn't just cruelty. It was calculated survival strategy wrapped in silk and pearls. The first queen on our list didn't just embrace this reality, she perfected it into something that would make serial killers take notes. Let's start with Queen Isabella of France, though history remembers her by a different name. The She-Wolf of France. And trust me, she earned every letter of that title through methods that make waterboarding look like a spa treatment. Born in 1295, Isabella seemed destined for the typical royal woman's life. Married off at 12 to secure a political alliance with England, she was expected to produce heirs and stay quiet while men made the real decisions. For the first 15 years of her marriage to King Edward II, she played the role perfectly. The dutiful wife, the devoted mother, the pious queen who attended Mass daily and embroidered altar cloths. But beneath that carefully constructed facade, something was growing, something dark and patient and absolutely ruthless. The breaking point came in 1321 when her husband's male favorite, Hugh Despenser, made a fatal mistake. He didn't just take political power from Isabella, he humiliated her. Publicly, in front of the entire English court. Despenser convinced Edward to strip Isabella of her lands, her income, even her children. She was reduced from Queen of England to a decorative ornament with no real power or purpose. Most women in her position would have accepted their fate. Maybe retreated to a convent. Maybe died quietly of mysterious circumstances like so many inconvenient royal wives before her. Isabella chose a different path. She chose war. But not the kind of war men fought with swords and armies. Isabella waged psychological warfare using fear as her primary weapon and human suffering as her ammunition. Her first victim was a minor nobleman named John de Warenne, who had publicly laughed when Despenser announced Isabella's punishment. Court records show that Isabella invited Warenne to a private dinner 6 months later. The invitation seemed like reconciliation. Medieval politics often required former enemies to make peace. Warrenny attended, expecting negotiations or perhaps a marriage alliance for one of his daughters. What happened next was documented by three separate witnesses, including a French diplomat who was so traumatized he requested immediate transfer back to Paris. Isabella didn't just kill Warren. She orchestrated his psychological destruction with the precision of a master craftsman. The dinner started normally. Good food, pleasant conversation, even entertainment from the court musicians. Warren relaxed. That was his first mistake. As the evening progressed, Isabella began telling stories. Innocent tales at first about court gossip and foreign politics. But gradually the stories became more specific. She described in detail how certain enemies of the crown had met unfortunate ends, how their families had suffered, how their children had been dealt with. Warren began to sweat. The diplomat noted that the man's hands were shaking so badly he couldn't hold his wine cup steady. That's when Isabella smiled and asked her servants to bring dessert. They wheeled in a covered silver platter, the kind typically used for roasted peacock or other elaborate presentations. When they lifted the cover, Warren screamed. It was his son's head. His youngest boy, barely 14 years old, arranged on a bed of fruit like a gruesome centerpiece. But Isabella wasn't finished. She had prepared a special surprise. The boy wasn't dead, not yet. His eyes moved. He tried to speak through the gag stuffed in his mouth. Medical experts today believe Isabella's torturers had used a paralytic poison that left the victim conscious but unable to move. Warren lunged for his son, but Isabella's guards restrained him. She forced him to watch as her personal torturer, a man she'd imported from the dungeons of Sicily, began his work. The process took 4 hours. 4 hours during which Warren was forced to remain seated at the dinner table, eating course after course while his son died by inches mere feet away. The diplomatic report describes Warren's condition by the end of the evening. The man had gone completely gray. Not just his hair, but his skin had taken on an ashen pallor that never returned to normal. His hands developed a permanent tremor. He stopped speaking except to mumble prayers. Within a week, he'd signed over all his lands to the crown and retreated to a monastery where he spent his remaining days in complete silence. But the truly diabolical part of Isabella's plan wasn't the torture itself. It was what happened next. She let Warren live. She could have killed him and seized his lands through normal conquest. Instead, she turned him into a living advertisement for what happened to those who crossed the she-wolf of France. Every noble in England heard the story. Every potential rebel learned exactly what Isabella was capable of when properly motivated. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Rebellion against the crown dropped to essentially zero. Nobles who had been plotting Edward's overthrow suddenly found urgent business in distant provinces. The mere mention of dinner invitations from Queen Isabella became a source of genuine terror among the English aristocracy. But Warren was just Isabella's opening statement. Her masterpiece of terror was still to come, and it would involve the very man who had humiliated her. Hugh Despenser thought he was safe because he controlled the king. He had no idea that Isabella had been planning his destruction for 2 years, gathering allies, studying his weaknesses, and designing a fate so horrific that historians still debate whether the accounts are exaggerated. They're not. If anything, the surviving records understate what Isabella did to Hugh Despenser, because some tortures are so creative, so psychologically devastating, that even medieval chroniclers couldn't bring themselves to document every detail. The fall of Hugh Despenser began with Isabella's diplomatic mission to France in 1325. Officially, she was negotiating peace terms with her brother, King Charles IV. Unofficially, she was building an invasion army and planning the most spectacular act of royal revenge in European history. She understood that simply killing Despenser wouldn't be enough. She needed to destroy him so completely that his name would become synonymous with suffering. Isabella spent months in France, not just gathering military support, but consulting with experts in the art of inflicting pain. She met with Inquisition torturers who had perfected methods of keeping victims conscious during extreme physical trauma. She studied with Arab physicians who understood human anatomy well enough to cause maximum agony without allowing the mercy of unconsciousness. She even consulted with a Byzantine executioner who specialized in psychological torture techniques that had been developed in Constantinople's imperial dungeons. By the time Isabella returned to England in 1396 with her invasion force, she had assembled what amounted to a medieval dream team of human suffering specialists. These weren't common torturers or executioners. These were artists whose medium was flesh and whose canvas was the human capacity for pain. Hugh Despenser's capture came sooner than expected. When Isabella's forces landed, Edward's support evaporated overnight. Nobles who had feared to oppose him for years suddenly remembered their loyalty to the rightful queen. Despenser found himself abandoned by all but a handful of die-hard supporters. He tried to flee by ship but was captured off the Welsh coast after a storm forced his vessel back to shore. The trial was a formality. Isabella had already decided Despenser's fate months earlier, but she wanted the legal proceedings recorded for posterity. She wanted future generations to understand that what happened next wasn't random cruelty. It was justice. Royal justice administered by a queen who had been pushed beyond her breaking point. The sentence, when finally read, took 20 minutes to deliver. Not because it was legally complex, but because Isabella had designed punishments that required detailed explanation. Despenser would be drawn through the streets of London, but not on a simple hurdle like common traders. Isabella had commissioned a special cart with iron spikes that would tear his flesh with every bump in the road. He would be hanged, but only until nearly unconscious, then revived with vinegar and spices to ensure he remained aware for what came next. The disembowelment would be performed while he lived, his organs removed piece by piece and burned before his eyes. But even this wasn't the worst part. Isabella had studied Despenser for years. She knew his greatest fear wasn't death or pain. His greatest fear was powerlessness. So she designed his torture to strip away every shred of dignity and control. The execution took place on November 24, 1326, and the crowds that gathered weren't there for entertainment. They came to witness the birth of a legend. The she-wolf of France wasn't just killing her enemy. She was creating a story that would echo through centuries, a cautionary tale about what happened when you underestimated a medieval queen's capacity for revenge. What happened during those final hours would establish Isabella's reputation as one of history's most creative torturers. But the techniques she employed were so advanced, so psychologically sophisticated, that they wouldn't be formally studied until the 20th century. Isabella had essentially invented psychological warfare centuries before psychologists understood how the human mind processes trauma, but Isabella wasn't unique. She was part of a tradition of royal women who understood that in medieval politics, fear was often more effective than love, and that the right kind of cruelty could prevent wars while the wrong kind of mercy invited rebellion. These queens didn't see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as survivors in a world where showing weakness meant death. Our next queen took Isabella's innovations even further, developing torture methods that combined physical agony with spiritual terror in ways that broke not just bodies, but souls. Queen Blanche of Castile understood something that modern interrogators are only now rediscovering. The human mind will do almost anything to avoid uncertainty. While other medieval rulers relied on brute force and obvious threats, Blanche perfected the art of psychological anticipation. She didn't just torture her enemies, she made them torture themselves with their own imagination. Born in 1188, Blanche seemed destined for the conventional life of a medieval royal wife. Married to the future King Louis VIII of France, she was expected to produce heirs and remain politically invisible. But when Louis died suddenly in 1226, leaving her as regent for their 12-year-old son, Blanche faced a kingdom in revolt. French nobles saw a foreign-born woman as easy prey. They were about to learn just how wrong they could be. The first rebellion came within months of Louis's death. A coalition of powerful barons, led by Pierre Mauclair of Brittany, declared that France needed a real ruler, not some Spanish woman playing at politics. They expected Blanche to negotiate, to make concessions, to behave like the weak female they assumed her to be. Instead, she invited Mauclair to Paris for peace talks. The meeting was scheduled for a week. Mauclair arrived with a small retinue, confident that he held all the advantages. Blanche received him graciously in the Great Hall of the Louvre, surrounded by tapestries and golden chalices that spoke of royal wealth and power. The negotiations began pleasantly enough. Discussions of territorial rights, tax obligations, marriage alliances for their respective children. But as the days progressed, strange things began happening to Mauclerc's delegation. Nothing obvious at first. A servant would mention casually that the Count's horse had developed a limp. Another would note that his favorite dish had been prepared, but perhaps the cook had used too much salt. Small inconveniences that could easily be coincidental. By the third day, Mauclerc's men were reporting more serious concerns. Their weapons had been moved during the night. Not stolen, just relocated to different rooms. Their private conversations seemed to be known by palace servants before they finished having them. Food began arriving at their chambers before they ordered it, as if someone knew their needs before they expressed them. The psychological pressure was subtle but relentless. Mauclerc found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering who was watching, who was listening, who was reporting his every movement back to the Queen. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the ancient palace, every shadow cast by flickering torches, every whispered conversation in the corridors could signal danger. On the fourth night, Mauclerc's youngest knight disappeared. Not violently. The man simply wasn't in his bed when morning came. His clothes remained folded. His sword lay untouched. It was as if he had evaporated into the stone walls themselves. When Mauclerc demanded explanations, palace officials expressed genuine surprise and concern. Search parties were organized. Guards were questioned. But no trace of the missing knight was ever found. That's when Blanche began her masterstroke. She started having private conversations with Mauclerc about the nature of power and loyalty. Not threats exactly, but philosophical discussions about how quickly circumstances could change. She told him stories of other nobles who had overestimated their position, how they had made miscalculations that cost them everything they held dear. The stories were always delivered with maternal concern, as if Blanche genuinely worried about Mauclerc's welfare. She spoke of Count Geoffrey of Anjou, who had challenged royal authority and found himself stripped of lands and titles within a single season. She mentioned Baron William of Normandy, whose entire family had suffered mysterious accidents after opposing the crown. Each tale was historically accurate, carefully researched, and precisely chosen to match some aspect of Mauclerc's current situation. By the sixth day, Mauclerc was a broken man. The confident rebel who had arrived planning to dictate terms to a weak woman was now jumping at shadows and seeing threats in every royal gesture. When Blanche finally made her offer, it wasn't negotiation. It was salvation from a nightmare that existed entirely in Mauclerc's own mind. The terms were devastating. Complete submission to royal authority. Massive territorial concessions. His eldest son to be raised at the French court as a hostage for his future loyalty. Under normal circumstances, Mauclerc would have rejected such demands without hesitation. Instead, he signed immediately, desperate to escape the psychological prison Blanche had constructed around him. But the true genius of Blanche's method revealed itself after Mauclerc returned to Brittany. He became the most loyal vassal in France, not because he feared royal armies, but because he could never be certain what Blanche might do if provoked again. The uncertainty was more effective than any threat. He spent the rest of his life wondering what had really happened to his missing knight, whether the palace servants were still watching him, whether his own people might be reporting to the French queen. The missing knight, incidentally, was found 3 months later in a monastery in Burgundy. He claimed to have no memory of how he got there or what had happened during his disappearance. Medical examination revealed no signs of violence or drug use. He simply couldn't remember. Modern psychiatrists would recognize the symptoms of induced dissociative amnesia, but in 1227 it seemed like witchcraft. Word of Mauclerc's mysterious transformation spread throughout the French nobility. Other potential rebels found urgent reasons to reaffirm their loyalty to Queen Blanche. The threat of royal displeasure became more terrifying than actual military action because nobody knew exactly what form that displeasure might take. Blanche refined her techniques over the following years, Developing a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that wouldn't be formally studied for centuries, she learned to identify each person's specific fears and vulnerabilities, then craft scenarios that made those fears seem not just possible but inevitable. For nobles who valued their family above all else, she would arrange for their relatives to receive special attention at court. Nothing harmful, just enough scrutiny to make it clear that their loved one's safety depended on continued loyalty. For those who prized their honor, she created situations where their reputation could be destroyed by whispered rumors that might or might not be true. For the greedy, she demonstrated how quickly wealth could disappear through taxes and confiscations that were technically legal but practically devastating. The psychological techniques Blanche pioneered became so effective that other European rulers began studying her methods. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II sent spies to the French court specifically to learn how a woman could control rebellious nobles without using traditional military force. The Pope himself requested detailed reports on how Blanche maintained order in what should have been an ungovernable kingdom. But Blanche's masterpiece wasn't her handling of French rebels. It was what she did to King Henry III of England when he dared to invade France in 1230, thinking he could take advantage of a kingdom ruled by a woman. Henry learned the hard way that Blanche's reputation for psychological warfare wasn't limited to dealing with her own subjects. The English invasion began confidently enough. Henry had assembled a substantial army and secured alliances with several French nobles who resented foreign rule. Military experts of the time gave England excellent chances of success. They were analyzing the wrong factors entirely. They understood traditional warfare but had no framework for comprehending what Blanche was about to do to their king's mind. Instead of meeting Henry's army in direct battle, Blanche began a campaign of psychological pressure that started before the English forces even landed in France. Henry began receiving gifts from anonymous sources, beautiful items that could have come from his enemies or his allies. A jeweled dagger with an inscription in Latin that could be read as either a blessing or a curse. A book of prayers with certain passages marked, though their significance remained unclear. A chess set where the king piece had been replaced with a figure that looked remarkably like Henry himself. The gifts continued after Henry reached France, delivered to his tent by messengers who vanished before they could be questioned. Each item was more unsettling than the last, designed to create a growing sense that Henry was being watched, studied, prepared for something he couldn't predict or prevent. Then the dream started. Henry began experiencing nightmares so vivid and specific that he became convinced someone was entering his mind while he slept. He dreamed of losing battles that hadn't been fought, of betrayals by allies who still seemed loyal, of deaths in his family that seemed prophetic rather than imaginary. Medieval understanding of psychology was limited, but Henry's physicians recognized the symptoms of severe mental distress. By the time Henry's army encountered French forces, the English king was already defeated psychologically. His decision-making became erratic. He ordered retreats when his forces held advantages, launched attacks when retreat would have been wiser, and constantly looked over his shoulder for threats that might not exist. The campaign collapsed not because of French military superiority, but because Henry could no longer function as a commander. The English retreat became a rout, then a complete disaster. Henry fled back across the Channel, leaving behind not just his army, but his confidence in his own judgment. He never attempted another invasion of France, and spent the rest of his reign dealing with domestic problems that seemed manageable compared to facing Queen Blanche again. But Blanche's psychological innovations were just the beginning. Other medieval queens studied her methods and developed their own variations, creating a tradition of royal women who understood that the mind was often a more effective battlefield than any physical terrain. Our next queen took these techniques in an even darker direction, combining psychological torture with physical mutilation in ways that created suffering so complete, so all-encompassing, that victims begged for death as mercy. Queen Joan of Naples didn't just hurt people. She erased them. Not their bodies, though those suffered terribly. She destroyed their sense of self, their understanding of reality, their connection to everything that made them human. What she did to her enemies went beyond torture into something that psychiatrists today would classify as systematic personality dissolution. Born in 1326, Joan inherited the throne of Naples at age 16, after her grandfather King Robert died without male heirs. The kingdom was in chaos. Rival claimants circled like vultures. Powerful noble families saw a teenage girl as their opportunity to seize power. They expected her to be grateful for their protection, to marry whoever they chose, to sign whatever documents they presented. Joan had different plans. Her first lesson in power came from her own family. Her cousin Charles of Durazzo, who believed he had a better claim to the throne, began spreading rumors about Joan's legitimacy. Not content with political opposition, he started whispering that she was mentally unstable, perhaps possessed by demons. In medieval Naples, such accusations could justify removing a ruler by force. Joan's response revealed the calculating mind that would terrorize southern Italy for decades. She didn't challenge Charles politically or militarily. Instead, she invited him to a family celebration at the Castel Nuovo, ostensibly to discuss their differences and find common ground. Charles arrived expecting negotiation. What he found was an education in psychological demolition that would redefine his understanding of fear. The celebration lasted 3 days, and Joan was the perfect hostess. She ensured Charles received the finest accommodations, the richest foods, the most entertaining diversions. But she also began implementing subtle psychological pressures that slowly unraveled his confidence. Servants would mention casually that his horse seemed nervous, as if sensing danger. Musicians would play songs that reminded him of his childhood fears. Conversations would drift toward topics that highlighted his vulnerabilities. On the second night, Joan arranged for Charles to witness something that would haunt him forever. Under the pretense of showing him the castle's renovated dungeons, she led him through corridors that had been specifically prepared for his visit. What Charles saw in those chambers went beyond traditional torture. Joan had created what she called her workshop, a place where she experimented with the boundaries between sanity and madness. The first room contained a man Charles recognized as Baron Tommaso di Sangro, a noble who had opposed Joan's rule 6 months earlier. But Di Sangro was no longer the proud aristocrat Charles remembered. The man sat motionless in a chair, staring at nothing, occasionally making sounds that weren't quite human. Joan explained matter-of-factly that Di Sangro had been undergoing personality adjustment. His arrogance had been surgically removed, she said, along with his capacity for independent thought. The process, Joan continued with the casual tone of someone discussing weather, involved careful application of pressure to specific points on the skull, combined with controlled sensory deprivation and the systematic destruction of memory patterns. Di Sangro could still perform basic functions, but his sense of self had been methodically erased. He remembered nothing of his former life, his family, his ambitions. He existed in a permanent state of confused dependency, requiring Joan's servants to tell him when to eat, when to sleep, when to speak. Charles tried to maintain his composure, but Joan wasn't finished with the tour. The next chamber held Countess Maria de Capua, a woman who had made the mistake of publicly questioning Joan's right to rule. Maria's punishment had been more subtle but equally devastating. Joan had convinced her that reality itself was unreliable, that her own memories couldn't be trusted, that everyone around her was part of an elaborate deception. Maria spent her days frantically writing letters to family members who might not exist, describing events that might never have happened, begging for confirmation of facts that might be completely fictional. Joan's torturers had become experts at gaslighting centuries before the term existed, systematically undermining their victims' ability to distinguish between truth and falsehood until the distinction became meaningless. The final chamber contained something that made Charles physically ill, a group of former rebels who had been subjected to Joan's most advanced techniques. These weren't broken individuals like Di Sangro or confused victims like Maria. These were people who had been rebuilt, their personalities reconstructed according to Joan's specifications. They moved in perfect synchronization, spoke in identical cadences, and displayed emotions only when Joan gave subtle signals. They had been turned into living puppets, retaining their intelligence and skills but lacking any independent will. Joan demonstrated by asking them to perform complex tasks, which they executed flawlessly while showing no signs of personal initiative or individual thought. They were conscious, aware, but completely hollow inside, their original selves replaced by artificial personalities that existed solely to serve Joan's purposes. Charles made it through the tour, but barely. By the third day of the celebration, he was agreeing to everything Joan suggested, signing documents that gave her complete authority over territories he had previously contested. More importantly, he became one of her most effective advocates, not because he supported her goals, but because he lived in constant terror of experiencing her workshop firsthand. Word of Joan's methods spread throughout the Italian peninsula, but in whispers rather than open discussion. Nobles who might have challenged a 16-year-old girl reconsidered their options when they learned what had happened to her previous opponents. The psychological impact was exactly what Joan intended. Fear became her most effective weapon, more powerful than any army. But Joan's innovations went beyond simple intimidation. She had discovered that the human mind could be manipulated like any other tool, reshaped according to specific requirements. Her victims weren't just punished for their crimes, they were transformed into cautionary tales, living examples of what happened when someone opposed the Queen of Naples. The techniques Joan developed were so advanced that they wouldn't be formally understood until psychologists began studying mind control in the 20th century. She had essentially invented psychological programming, using combinations of sensory manipulation, memory disruption, and identity dissolution to create whatever personality she needed from her victims. Her methods attracted attention from across Europe. Other rulers sent observers to study her techniques, though few had the stomach to implement them fully. The Pope himself received detailed reports about Joan's activities, but chose to ignore them rather than confront a ruler who had proven so effective at maintaining order in a historically chaotic kingdom. Joan's workshop expanded over the years, becoming a sophisticated research facility where she tested new approaches to mental manipulation. She kept detailed records of her experiments, documenting which techniques were most effective for different personality types. Proud nobles required different treatments than greedy merchants or ambitious clergy. Each category of victim needed customized approaches to achieve complete psychological reconstruction. The physical aspects of her torture were almost secondary to the mental destruction she inflicted. Bodies heal, Joan understood, but minds could be broken permanently if the damage was applied with sufficient precision. She developed techniques that left no visible marks while creating trauma so deep that victims' personalities never recovered. Her most sophisticated work involved what she called mirror therapy. Victims would be forced to watch recordings of their own actions, but edited and presented in ways that made them question their own memories and motivations. They would see themselves committing acts they didn't remember, speaking words they couldn't recall, displaying emotions that felt foreign. Over time, they lost confidence in their own perceptions, becoming dependent on Joan's version of reality. The psychological manipulation was combined with carefully controlled physical discomfort. Not enough to cause permanent damage, but sufficient to keep victims in a constant state of low-level distress. Sleep deprivation, irregular feeding schedules, uncomfortable temperatures, and unpredictable lighting all contributed to mental instability that made subjects more susceptible to psychological reconstruction. Joan's reputation eventually extended beyond Italy. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their courts about the Queen of Naples, who could break human minds like others broke horses. Some described her as a monster, others as a genius, who had discovered secrets about human nature that could revolutionize statecraft. All agreed that she represented something new and terrifying in European politics. The most disturbing aspect of Joan's reign wasn't the cruelty itself, but the calm efficiency with which she applied it. She never seemed angry or sadistic when implementing her techniques. Instead, she approached psychological torture with the detached professionalism of a craftsman perfecting his trade. Her victims were materials to be worked with, problems to be solved, challenges that required technical innovation. This clinical approach made her methods even more effective. Victims couldn't predict her moods or find ways to appease her anger because anger wasn't driving her actions. She was simply applying the most effective techniques available to achieve her political objectives. The complete absence of personal emotion made resistance seem pointless and escape impossible. Joan ruled Naples for nearly 4 decades, dying peacefully in her bed at age 56. Her kingdom remained stable throughout her reign, not because of popular support or military strength, but because potential opponents understood the consequences of rebellion. She had created a system of government based entirely on psychological deterrence, proving that fear could be more effective than love in maintaining royal authority. Her techniques influenced medieval statecraft across Europe, though few rulers had the stomach to implement them as thoroughly as Joan had. The knowledge that such methods existed changed how nobles calculated the risks of opposing royal authority. Even kings and queens who never used psychological torture benefited from the possibility that they might, creating a new dynamic in European politics where mental warfare became as important as traditional military strength. But Joan's legacy extended beyond political innovation. She had demonstrated that human consciousness itself could be weaponized, that the mind was just another battlefield where victories could be won through superior tactics and better preparation. Her workshop became a prototype for psychological warfare techniques that wouldn't be formally developed until the 20th century. The records of her methods were carefully preserved by subsequent rulers of Naples, creating a library of psychological manipulation techniques that influenced European statecraft for centuries. Even today, some of Joan's innovations remain classified in Vatican archives, considered too dangerous for public knowledge. Our next queen learned from Joan's example but took psychological warfare in an even more disturbing direction. Where Joan focused on breaking individual minds, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria discovered how to drive entire populations into madness, using mass psychology to maintain control over a kingdom that should have been ungovernable. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria understood something that modern crowd psychologists are only beginning to grasp. Individual minds can be broken, but collective madness spreads like wildfire, consuming entire societies with a speed that makes traditional conquest look sluggish. While other medieval rulers focused on controlling their enemies one at a time, Isabeau discovered how to infect whole populations with carefully crafted hysteria. Born around 1370, Isabeau arrived in France as a teenage bride to the mentally unstable King Charles VI. The French court expected her to fade into decorative irrelevance, producing heirs while her husband's periodic descents into madness were managed by male regents. But when Charles's condition worsened, leaving him convinced he was made of glass and liable to shatter at any touch, Isabeau saw opportunity where others saw crisis. The kingdom was fracturing. English armies pressed from the north. Burgundian and Armagnac factions tore at each other's throats. Noble families plotted constantly, each believing they could seize power from a foreign queen married to a lunatic king. What they didn't realize was that Isabeau had been studying them, learning their fears, mapping their weaknesses, preparing to unleash something far worse than military defeat. Her first experiment in mass psychological manipulation came during the winter of 1405 when food shortages created unrest in Paris. Instead of addressing the economic crisis directly, Isabeau began spreading carefully crafted rumors about the true cause of the kingdom's suffering. Not failed harvests or military expenses, but supernatural forces that had been awakened by the sins of ungrateful subjects. The rumors started in churches, whispered by priests who had been convinced that divine punishment was manifesting through earthly hardships. Strange omens were reported with increasing frequency. Statues that wept blood, holy water that turned black during Mass, newborn animals with human faces. Each story was more disturbing than the last, and each contained just enough plausible detail to seem credible. Within weeks, Parisian citizens were reporting their own supernatural encounters. Shadows that moved independently, voices calling their names from empty rooms. Dreams so vivid they seemed more real than waking life. The hysteria spread through the population like plague, creating a shared psychosis that made rational thought nearly impossible. Isabeau fed this growing madness with strategic interventions. Public executions were scheduled to coincide with astronomical events, creating the impression that cosmic forces were demanding blood sacrifice. Court astrologers, carefully coached by the Queen, proclaimed that the kingdom's salvation required absolute obedience to royal authority, Any questioning of the crown's decisions was reframed as collaboration with demonic forces threatening France itself. The psychological pressure reached breaking point during the spring of 1407 when Isabeau orchestrated what she called the Great Revelation. Using a network of agents planted throughout Paris, she arranged for hundreds of citizens to experience simultaneous visions of the kingdom's future under continued rebellion. The visions were remarkably consistent, describing in horrific detail how defiance of royal authority would lead to plague, invasion, and the literal opening of hell on French soil. The mass hallucination wasn't spontaneous. Isabeau's agents had spent months mapping the city's social networks, identifying influential individuals who could spread specific narratives to their neighbors. They used combinations of suggestion, mild poisoning with ergot-contaminated grain, and carefully timed theatrical effects to create experiences that seemed supernatural, but were actually meticulously planned psychological operations. The effect was immediate and devastating. Potential rebels found themselves facing not just royal opposition, but the fury of their own neighbors, who now believed that political resistance was equivalent to demonic collaboration. Loyalty to the crown became a religious duty, enforced not by soldiers but by citizens who had been convinced that their eternal souls depended on supporting Queen Isabeau. But mass hysteria was just the foundation of Isabeau's system. Her real innovation was learning to control and direct collective madness for specific political purposes. When the Duke of Orléans began gathering support for a coup in 1407, Isabeau didn't send armies to stop him. Instead, she convinced the population of Paris that Orléans was literally possessed by demons, using his own political activities as evidence of supernatural corruption. The campaign against Orléans demonstrated Isabeau's understanding of how crowds process information differently than individuals. Where personal manipulation required careful attention to individual psychology, mass manipulation relied on triggering primitive emotional responses that bypassed rational thought entirely. Fear, anger, disgust, and religious fervor could be weaponized against entire populations if the triggers were applied with sufficient skill. Isabeau's agents began spreading stories about Orléans that combined political criticism with supernatural horror. His late-night meetings became devil worship ceremonies. His wealth came from selling French souls to English demons. His supporters weren't political allies, but corrupted thralls who had traded their humanity for earthly power. Each accusation was designed to provoke visceral revulsion rather than logical analysis. The psychological assault culminated when Orléans was assassinated by agents of the Duke of Burgundy, but Isabeau ensured the murder was interpreted as divine justice rather than political violence. Witnesses reported that the Duke's body showed signs of demonic possession, that his blood burned the ground where it fell, that his dying words were curses in languages that predated human speech. None of these details were true, but they became accepted facts among a population primed to interpret everything through supernatural frameworks. The success of the Orléans operation established Isabeau as the undisputed master of what would later be called information warfare. She had proven that carefully crafted narratives could be more powerful than armies, that controlling how people interpreted events was more effective than controlling the events themselves. Reality became whatever Isabeau needed it to be, shaped by the collective beliefs she had engineered. Her techniques evolved rapidly as she refined her understanding of mass psychology. She learned to identify which emotional triggers worked best on different social groups. Merchants responded to fears about economic collapse. Nobles worried about threats to their honor and status. Clergy could be manipulated through concerns about religious orthodoxy. Peasants were most vulnerable to superstitious terror about supernatural punishment. Each group required customized approaches, but Isabeau discovered that certain themes resonated across all social boundaries. The fear of contamination, either physical or spiritual, could unite aristocrats and commoners in shared paranoia. The promise of purification through violence appealed to both religious fanatics and secular opportunists. The threat of foreign corruption spoke to nationalist sentiments while providing excuses for attacking domestic opponents. By 1410, Isabeau had perfected what amounted to psychological mass production. She could generate hysteria on demand, directing popular fury against whatever target served her political needs. When English forces threatened Paris, she convinced citizens that the invasion was divine punishment for insufficient loyalty to the crown. When food shortages created unrest, she redirected anger toward Jewish communities who were accused of poisoning wells and hoarding grain. The Jewish pogroms of 1412 demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of Isabeau's system. Using carefully planted rumors about ritual murder and supernatural conspiracy, she transformed economic frustration into religious violence that eliminated potential sources of alternative leadership while providing scapegoats for popular anger. The massacres served multiple purposes, removing wealthy merchants who might fund opposition, while reinforcing the narrative that France's problems came from foreign corruption rather than royal mismanagement. The psychological mechanisms Isabeau exploited wouldn't be formally understood for centuries, but her intuitive grasp of crowd behavior allowed her to manipulate entire populations with techniques that modern propagandists would recognize as sophisticated. She understood that people in groups process information differently than individuals, becoming more susceptible to emotional manipulation while losing the capacity for critical analysis. Her success inspired imitation across Europe, but few rulers possessed the patience or precision required to implement her methods effectively. Mass psychological manipulation required careful preparation, extensive intelligence networks, and the ability to maintain consistent narratives across multiple communication channels. Most medieval monarchs preferred direct confrontation to the subtle warfare that Isabeau had mastered. The long-term effects of Isabeau's reign extended far beyond her immediate political objectives. She had demonstrated that human societies could be programmed like individual minds, that collective beliefs could be engineered to serve specific purposes. The techniques she developed influenced European statecraft for generations, creating precedents for the use of psychological warfare that would eventually evolve into modern propaganda and mass media manipulation. Her most disturbing innovation was the discovery that madness could be contagious if properly cultivated. Individual insanity was a personal tragedy, but collective insanity became a political tool that could reshape entire civilizations. Isabeau had learned to create shared delusions so powerful that they became more real than objective truth, at least for the populations caught within their influence. The records of her methods were carefully studied by subsequent French rulers, creating an institutional memory of psychological manipulation techniques that influenced royal policy for centuries. Even the Sun King Louis XIV would employ variations of Isabeau's crowd control methods, though none of her successors matched her ability to generate mass hysteria on command. But Isabeau's legacy raises questions that extend beyond medieval history into contemporary concerns about mass media, social networks, and the manipulation of public opinion. Her techniques for controlling collective beliefs seem remarkably modern, suggesting that the human capacity for mass delusion hasn't evolved significantly over the past 6 centuries. Our final queen learned from all her predecessors but developed something even more sinister than individual torture or mass hysteria. She discovered how to turn love itself into a weapon, using the deepest human emotions as tools of destruction that left victims grateful for their own annihilation. Queen Catherine de Medici arrived in France in 1547 with a reputation for sophistication and learning that masked something far darker. The Italian princess had been educated in psychological techniques that made previous queens' methods seem crude by comparison. Where others relied on fear or madness, Catherine understood that the most effective control came through manipulating the emotions that people treasured most deeply. Her approach to torture wasn't about breaking her victims. It was about convincing them to break themselves while believing they were acting out of love, loyalty, or moral necessity. Catherine had discovered that the human capacity for self-destruction was unlimited if the right emotional triggers were activated. People would endure any suffering, commit any atrocity, if they could be convinced that their actions served someone or something they loved. The technique that would define her reign began with a simple observation about human nature. Everyone needs to feel needed, to believe that their existence serves some greater purpose. Catherine learned to identify these deep psychological needs in her enemies, then create situations where satisfying those needs required their own destruction. She turned self-sacrifice from virtue into weapon, making martyrdom seem like the only path to meaning. Her first major demonstration came when dealing with the Protestant rebellion, led by Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. Instead of simply executing the Huguenot leader, Catherine embarked on a campaign of emotional manipulation that would transform him from enemy into unwitting accomplice in his own faction's destruction. The process began with Catherine appearing to convert to his cause, not publicly but through carefully orchestrated private meetings where she expressed doubts about Catholic doctrine and admiration for Protestant theology. She played the role of a conflicted queen, torn between political necessity and spiritual truth, seeking guidance from the very man she planned to destroy. Coligny, convinced of his own righteousness and eager to save a royal soul, became emotionally invested in Catherine's supposed conversion. He spent hours explaining Reformed theology, sharing personal struggles with faith, opening his heart to a woman he believed was genuinely seeking salvation. What he didn't realize was that every confession, every moment of vulnerability, was being cataloged and weaponized. Catherine's agents began spreading word among Huguenot communities that their leader was conducting secret theological discussions with the Queen herself. The story was crafted to make Coligny seem like a spiritual hero, gradually winning over the most powerful woman in France through pure faith and moral conviction. His followers were filled with pride at their leader's missionary work, completely unaware that they were celebrating their own doom. The emotional trap closed slowly. Catherine began asking Coligny to prove his theological points through actions that seemed reasonable but gradually isolated him from his support network. Could he demonstrate Protestant charity by pardoning Catholic prisoners? Could he show Christian forgiveness by calling off planned attacks on Catholic strongholds? Each request was framed as spiritual growth, a queen learning to embody the virtues her teacher preached. Coligny found himself making concessions that weakened his military position while believing he was winning the greatest conversion in French history. His advisors grew concerned about his strategic decisions, but he dismissed their worries as lack of faith. How could they understand the miracle happening before their eyes? The Queen Mother of France was about to become Protestant, potentially transforming the entire kingdom. The final phase began when Catherine claimed her conversion was complete, but required public validation to be politically viable. She needed Coligny to organize a great assembly where Protestant leaders would witness her formal embrace of Reformed faith. The gathering would demonstrate that France's future lay with the true church rather than papal corruption. Coligny threw himself into the preparations with religious fervor. He contacted Protestant leaders across Europe, inviting them to witness this unprecedented triumph of faith over politics. The assembly was planned for Paris in August 1572, timed to coincide with the wedding of Catherine's daughter to the Protestant King Henry of Navarre. The symbolism was perfect. A Catholic-Protestant royal marriage followed by the Queen Mother's conversion would signal a new era of religious unity. What Coligny couldn't see was how completely he had been manipulated into creating his own massacre. The gathering he was organizing with such devotion would become the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, where thousands of Protestant leaders were slaughtered in a coordinated attack that Catherine had been planning for months. The psychological devastation wasn't limited to the physical violence. As Protestant leaders gathered in Paris, many expressing gratitude to Coligny for arranging their triumph, he began to understand what was really happening. The woman he thought he had converted revealed her true intentions gradually, allowing him to watch in horror as his spiritual pride became the instrument of his followers' destruction. Catherine ensured that Coligny survived the initial assault, keeping him alive long enough to witness the full scope of what his emotional manipulation had accomplished. She visited him as he lay dying, explaining with clinical precision how every conversation, every moment of supposed spiritual connection had been carefully crafted to lead to this moment. The Admiral's final hours were spent not just in physical agony, but in the complete collapse of his understanding of himself and his cause. The woman he had tried to save had never needed salvation. The conversion he had celebrated was entirely fictional. The gathering he had organized as a triumph of faith became the greatest disaster in Protestant French history. But Catherine's true masterpiece wasn't the massacre itself. It was how she had turned Coligny's deepest virtues against him. His desire to save souls became the mechanism of his followers' damnation. His pride in spiritual leadership became the trap that destroyed his movement. His capacity for love and hope became weapons that Catherine wielded with surgical precision. The psychological techniques Catherine employed represented the evolution of royal torture from physical brutality to emotional annihilation. She had discovered that the human spirit could be broken more completely through corrupted love than through any amount of pain. When people destroyed themselves believing they were serving something beautiful, the devastation reached levels that traditional torture could never achieve. Her methods influenced French court politics for generations, creating a tradition of emotional manipulation that made the royal court one of the most psychologically dangerous places in Europe. Nobles learned to guard not just their lives, but their hearts, understanding that genuine emotion could become a weapon in skilled hands. The legacy of these medieval queens reveals something disturbing about human nature and the evolution of power. Each generation of female rulers built upon the innovations of their predecessors, developing increasingly sophisticated methods of control that targeted the deepest aspects of human psychology. What began with Isabella's crude but effective physical torture evolved into Catherine's ability to turn love itself into an instrument of destruction. These women weren't monsters, despite what their methods might suggest. They were products of a political system that demanded absolute control while providing limited resources for achieving it. In a world where showing weakness meant death, they developed techniques that ensured their enemies would never recover enough to threaten them again. The documentation of their methods, preserved in archives across Europe, reveals a systematic progression toward what we would now recognize as psychological warfare. These queens were essentially conducting advanced research into human behavior, discovering principles that wouldn't be formally studied until the 20th century. Their innovations changed the nature of medieval politics, proving that intellectual warfare could be more devastating than physical violence. The fear these women inspired outlasted their reigns, influencing European statecraft long after their deaths. Future rulers might not employ their exact methods, but the knowledge that such techniques existed changed how power was calculated and exercised. Today, as we grapple with questions about manipulation, control, and the weaponization of information, these medieval queens seem remarkably contemporary. Their understanding of human psychology, developed through centuries of practical application, offers disturbing insights into how minds can be controlled and destroyed. The most chilling aspect of their legacy isn't the specific tortures they employed, but their demonstration that human consciousness itself can be hacked, reprogrammed, and destroyed through sufficiently advanced manipulation. They proved that with enough skill and patience, anyone can be convinced to destroy themselves while believing they're serving something greater. Perhaps the real horror isn't what these queens did to their enemies, but what they revealed about the potential that exists within all systems of power. When authority goes unchecked and consequences disappear, the human capacity for sophisticated cruelty seems unlimited. These weren't fairy tale villains, but real women who discovered that the deepest torture's target, not the body, but the soul, not the flesh, but the very foundations of identity and belief. They perfected techniques for destroying people while leaving them technically alive, creating forms of suffering so complete that death would have been mercy. Their methods died with them, but their legacy persists in every system where power operates without accountability, where psychological manipulation masquerades as leadership, where the vulnerable are convinced to participate in their own destruction. The medieval queens who tortured their enemies didn't just kill people, they killed the possibility of resistance itself, creating forms of control so absolute that victims became grateful for their own annihilation. In the end, perhaps that's their most terrifying achievement, proving that under the right circumstances, anyone can be made to love their own destruction.